Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. This year's G20 summit will be held amid a sluggish global economic recovery and rising sentiment of trade protectionism and anti-globalization. What is the world looking for in terms of global economic growth and governance? How can China play a leadership role as chair of this year's summit? And what will the summit bring to China? To discuss these questions and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Liu Yunyun, Assistant Executive Editor of Beijing Review, and Xu Qingduo, a current affairs commentator from China Radio International. But before we get started, let's take a quick look at this background report.
As the global economy continues to languish, the summit, themed towards an innovative, revitalized, interconnected and inclusive world economy, will draw significant attention from the watching world.
The G20 summit is very important this year because there's so much uncertainty in the world economy. With a downturn in the growth and trade, with the problems in Europe and the potential departure of the United Kingdom from the European Union, and it's important for the G20 countries to assume a leadership position and show a way towards future growth in trade and the economic performance of the 20 countries.
As the host country, China hopes to take the opportunity to reach agreements on economic and strategic cooperation as well as other global issues. For the first time in G20 history, China is putting the issue of development as a main priority for the global macro policy framework. Many foreign officers think it is critically important that China is being innovative to achieve economic growth, as it is a strategic force driving the world economy and global economic cooperation.
Well, I think that the major roles of the Chinese presidency of the G20 has been innovation, without any doubt, and how to put all the world to work together to really reach priority goals. And I think that has been probably the best presidency up to now.
As it makes ready to welcome the leaders from G20 member nations and more than 500 global business representatives, China's eastern city of Hangzhou is well prepared for the summit, having completed all of the facilities and a renovation of local communities. The city aims to increase its international reputation and improve livelihoods by hosting the big event.
We've accomplished a renovation on over 9 million square meters of old communities, factories and slums. We've also reconstructed water supply, gas, electricity and telecommunication systems. We realized it's far more than the preparation work for the G20 summit, but actually for the benefit of our people.
Welcome to Dialogue. Given the backdrop of the sluggish global recovery, what are your expectations for the leadership role of the chair, namely the PRC in Hangzhou?
Well, my biggest expectations is how leaders of the G20 members can agree on something which can benefit all countries, whether they can make plans and take collective actions, which is not focused on the short-term growth, but also focused on the long-term development plans. Not just good for, let's say, developed economies, but also good for developing economies.
I think you put your finger on a very critical concept of co-prosperity and being inclusive for the leadership of the G20. What do you make of the principle or subject matter of this year's G20 in Hangzhou?
Well, of course, the subject matter is economic growth, or sustainable, balanced, inclusive growth. But for me personally, I think there is a rising trend of protectionism, trade protectionism, and also this trend of anti-globalization, and also the rise of populism, as demonstrated in Brexit from the European Union, and also the nomination of Donald Trump as the Republican presidential candidate of the Republican Party in the US. So that's a disturbing trend. I think if the G20 summit meeting could send out a clear and a strong signal, that is, they are committed to free trade and globalization, that would be very reassuring to the market and the international community.
But those who are skeptical about the vision of G20 would point out good idea is one thing, execution of the good ideas is quite another when it comes to, for example, the commitment to globalization. But what do you make of the note of pessimism about anti-globalization? What does anti-globalization actually mean here in this context?
Well, you are absolutely right, Yang Rui. Populism and trade protectionism is certainly on the rise, as demonstrated by the Brexit and the popularity of Donald Trump. And I think, well, we need to look at the consequences of those populism or the trade protectionism. And let's take the UK. After Brexit, the referendum is out, and then the UK government bond yields hit record lows. So if there's one thing about market which is certain is that they don't like political uncertainty. So if every country adopts the same exclusive, isolated, and also a self-centered approach in this 21st century, and I think it will be a disaster for world economy.
Will member countries be able to shift the emphasis to economic growth, which can enhance the world's security instead of falling into a geopolitical trap? I believe the understatement of this question actually refers to the geopolitical rivalry between the two biggest economies, the United States and China. For the United States, it calls for the establishment of DPP, which is questioned seriously by Donald Trump and perhaps by Hillary Clinton herself. Also, we called for the bigger role of AIIB, which is a fan of the idea, for example, being inclusive and co-prosperity. What do you make of the alleged geopolitical trap?
Well, I'm not that optimistic in terms of whether we will fall into the trap, geopolitical trap, or somehow we can manage to focus on economic cooperation or globalization. It's really up to the United States and up to Japan, the big powers here. They have this, TPP. One of the principle or one of the rules of TPP or TTIP between U.S. and European countries is, as said, like ABC, the principle, anyone but China. So, even in terms of globalization or say free trade agreement, it's somehow about geopolitical calculation. That is like a U.S. President Obama once said publicly, if we don't write the rules, China will do. So it's about the rivalry. The rivalry is about the management of the rivalry, management of the relationship, whether it will be running out of control or somehow it's being managed under control. So the focus is still on cooperation, while at the same time we have rivalry probably geographically.
Part of the essence for this G20 summit in Hangzhou is a pursuit of co-prosperity, as I said earlier, and interconnectivity. Do you think, in terms of interconnectivity, the One Belt and One Road initiative could be described as a therapy, if not an overdose, to the U.S. accusation that China enjoys free riding? What do you think of the blueprint of Mr. Xi Jinping in this regard?
Well, the One Road and One Belt initiative is actually proved to be very successful because it has been accepted by a lot of countries, let's say in Central Asia and in European countries and also in North African nations. It is also a demonstration which shows China, it is not just free rider, perhaps it is in the past, but now it is more want to play a more important role in the construction of global economic buildup. So it is actually China's commitment to world peace, because peace, economic prosperity brings peaceful development, and that will probably end the decades-long religious extremism and sometimes the terrorist activities.
Well, I'm afraid your statement that economic prosperity may hopefully bring an end to religious extremism may be questioned by those who criticize Saudi Arabia, where you have the madrasa school, the rise of religious extremism, which lays the groundwork for the rise of ISIL in the Middle East. I'm not talking about Saudi Arabia, the government itself, but about the general conservative culture, a religious one, in some of the players of the Middle East. What do you think of the contradiction that is implied in her bold statement that economic prosperity will hopefully terminate religious extremism?
Well, it's hard to say, what is the solution to extremism. We know since 9/11, the U.S. launched this global war against the terror. But, many years have been gone. Now we can see terrorism is still there. And in a sense, terrorism is rising with ISIL, producing a new nation in the Middle East. And also you can see the ongoing war in Syria, Iraq, Libya is also all about ISIS or ISIL. And European countries, they are suffering, like a serious small-scale terror attacks in Germany, in France, and also now they're expanding to Afghanistan and even Asian countries. So are we successful? I'm not sure. But at least One Belt, One Road provides one of the possible solutions. That is, if you give young people, unemployed probably, give the chance to work and give them to receive a monthly salary, a handsome salary, so they have a time at least to enjoy life, to stay at home, instead of doing something like a suicide bombing.
Well, I want to add something because
Go ahead, please.
You said there are a lot of turbulences in those areas, for instance, in North Africa and in the Middle East regions, partly because the interference of some major powers like the United States. So if what China can bring, we're not bringing conflicts to any region. What we're trying to provide to the world.
But I'm afraid you have underestimated China's reluctance to be a major player, to broker deals, serious ones in the Middle East, because given the complexity of ethnic and religious rivalry between the Sunnis, Shiites, moderates and extremists, secular ones and fundamentalists, jihadists, so on and so forth, it will be a graveyard for the major powers. Don't you think so?
I totally agree. I think you do see like a Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Iran, Egypt, and also Saudi Arabia. China is trying to play a role, like a neutral role, basically to be friends with everybody in this Middle Eastern region here, which has been known for not only oil production but also chaos, let's say. So China is trying, basically, Chinese is following this principle of non-interference in domestic affairs. If it's Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Syria, that's your own domestic affairs. We don't want to interfere. But what we can do is to do infrastructure in construction or issuing loans, soft loans to help you if you need the help. But we don't impose our wills on your national construction. So that's one way, particular way, very different from the US practice there.
Right, let's come back to examine the very idea of G20. Will it be as effective as it was in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008? Many skeptical guys who are left disillusioned by the lackluster performance of BRICS countries say it doesn't make any sense any longer. G7, for example, is making a comeback. What do you think of the regrouping of G7? Will it play a leading role in sharp contrast with the poor performance of G20? By G20, I mean those emerging markets.
Well, see, that is the charm of the G20. Well, in the case of G7 or G8, I'm really confused because you cannot just kick somebody out simply because you don't like him or her. So in G20, which brings leaders from developed countries and developing nations, leaders can sit together and find out if they have some common ground. Say, you may hate somebody to your guts, but here in G20, you have to sit down and talk with them and to see, well, if there is something you can, talk about, and then at the end of the day, come out with that agreement, which can be helpful to the benefit of all mankind.
Thank you very much. You're watching Dialogue with Liu Yunyun and Xu Qingduo. We are discussing the upcoming G20 summit in Hangzhou and what China can do to assume a leadership role in assisting the recovery of the world economy. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us. Welcome back. I was in Johannesburg to cover the dialogue between China and most of the African countries. One subject matter was China's determination to assist with the process of reindustrialization in African countries. Now, when you talk about the revitalization of the economies in developing countries, you have to look at the issue of industrialization. But what are the major obstacles in the process of reindustrialization, given the drop in commodity prices and the drop in oil prices as well?
You mean in which area?
In developing countries, in Africa or other emerging markets, industrialization seems to have met the winter of different kinds.
Well, I think the that's the reason why China needs to step up and do its due contributions. Well, China is coping with its own problems, like excess industrial capacity. So if China can bring with it the technology and the personnel needed to help those countries and to reinvigorate their economies, and then I think it would be very helpful to revitalize the industries in like African or other developing economies.
A joint statement is likely to be issued by the end of the Hangzhou G20 summit. But what about the multilateral diplomacy on the sidelines of the G20 summit, such as the one to be held between President Putin and his Chinese counterpart, the host, Mr. Xi Jinping? What will be the major issues to be addressed?
Well, between China and Russia, obviously the two countries have been getting closer and closer in terms of overall relationship, energy production, and also export to each other. And what is being expected is about further cooperation with the One Belt, One Road initiative by China, and also the EEC, basically from the Russian side. Somehow they will bring all the countries, Russia, European countries, and China, Central Europe together. It's a grand scheme. We don't know the details yet, but I guess after the summit, after the meeting between the two presidents, probably we will get more about the details of the grand plan. How will it be helpful to both sides and also to countries within this grand scheme?
Now, China has been widely praised for successfully hosting the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing, the 2010 World Expo in Shanghai, and the 2014 APEC Economic Leaders Meeting in Beijing. But what has China actually gained by hosting these big events? Is it a major public relations activity, or will it benefit China or members of G20?
Well, I think one thing, it will generate GDP for the local economy. That's that aside, it will generate like a number of skilled workers, because it will generate like short-term employment, and then these workers can acquire necessary skills for the jobs they're doing. So in the longer term, they can be more skilled in doing the jobs, and then in other places, in other projects, and maybe all over the world. So skilled labor force brings efficiency. That is partly the reason why China's speed is so impressive.
Right. The choice of Hangzhou makes some sense, perhaps, for some of the careful observers. For example, Alibaba is headquartered in Hangzhou, and we talk about the spirit of innovation, interconnectivity, reinvigoration, whatever subject matter of G20. Do you think throughout the G20 summit, in terms of economic recovery, e-commerce and the boom of such a lucrative industry will bring about a silver lining for lackluster economic performance around the world?
Well, I do think so. I think this is also one of the major themes of this G20 summit. There is a theme called like inclusive innovation. Well, innovation being technology, let's say, inclusive being development. That is inclusive development through technology. It is like a tech term, sort of like basically producing the technology or innovation by or for the poor people, and then poor people will benefit from that. I can give you some example, like the mobile phone. If there's only one mobile phone, that is iPhone, the only middle class or upper people can probably purchase it, can afford to purchase it. For people who are not that financially strong, probably you won't have access to this mobile phone, this is a smartphone. But with Xiaomi, with the production of Xiaomi mobile phones, so a lot of people probably you don't have a high salary, don't have a very good salary. You can still have the access to mobile technology and smartphone, and also mobile internet. That will create galvanize a lot of people to log on social media, to express themselves, and to even create their own business. So that is the way, so-called innovation, is economic development through innovation.
Innovation is one of the major issues on the agenda of G20. By the end of the day, when we look at the issue of economic recovery, it's a matter of confidence, right? But a review of the Chinese GDP in the first half of 2016, you get a picture of a lackluster investment from the non-public sector. and the inaction of local government officials due to the crackdown campaign could be one major factor. Now, what do you think of the driving force of the Chinese economy in terms of delivering a clear message to the rest of the world? Confidence is even more expensive than gold.
Well, you're right, especially in market, confidence is gold. But actually, what I want to say is that innovation is also very important. For one thing, it is the theme of the meeting, and then if a company can outperform other companies in terms of innovation, it is very likely that the company will take a greater share of profits and likely to rise up the ladder of global companies. And the same success story is applicable to the growth of a nation. So what I'm saying, confidence is gold, important, and innovation maybe is silver.
Well, I think, like the confidence, if you look at the Chinese economic growth here, yes, you're right. The private sector investment is coming down. And the public sector investment from the public spending, let's say from the government, is actually growing. So that's basically is making up for the loss of the investment from private sector. But at the same time, if you look at the Chinese economic growth, around 60% of the GDP is actually relying on consumption and services. This is an indicator of the success of the transition from the relying on investment and heavy investment and export to a growth model which is based on consumption and services. I think in general the growth has been successful, stable, so it is still an ongoing stage of the transition.
Along with the G20 in Hangzhou, we start to see a series of side products such as T20 and B20. T20, we mean, is a think tank from these member states of G20. And the B20 actually refers to business summit meeting, gathering over 800 business leaders from G20 member nations and global businesses. This B20 will be held before G20 summit. Fewer than 10 Chinese enterprises have participated in past B20 summits, but 156 Chinese companies will take part in this summit this year. What do you think of the role of the Chinese enterprises in what amounts to the idea of global governance or corporate governance in the world economy?
Well, in the past, the Chinese businesses, they are like, we do our own businesses. We don't bother with the decision-making process. But now, with the increasing role of China in global economics, and then the Chinese companies are like, we need to be part of the decision-making process. And we want to set the rules for future competition. And we don't want to be left behind. So that shows a great sense of confidence of Chinese companies in themselves and their confidence in their interest in decision-making process.
What do you think should be the competitive edge of the Chinese enterprises? That's question number one. Number two, I'm afraid, what do you make of the outbound flight of capital in terms of overseas investment as well as mergers and acquisition? Do we have a better global context for having more of the Chinese investment?
Well, I think, to answer your second question first, let's say, people talked a lot about the flight of capital from China. I think it's basically it's a natural process of the capital, free flow of capital across national borders. So it's hard to define which is exactly capital flight from China because of the economic situation. Actually, probably China is the only big power which is enjoying like 6 to 7% economic growth. So this is actually the destination for investment for your capital. And M&A by Chinese companies has been growing over the past couple of years. So it's a very encouraging, let's say, situation. According to one figure, until 6 years later, 2020 actually, China will become the largest source of FDI, foreign direct investment in other countries. So China will basically not only export finished products, but also the financial resources here. That is a great help. And this is part of the help is from not from the Chinese government, the Chinese banks, is from the Chinese business community.
In terms of being the biggest contributor of FDI overseas, it depends somehow on whether RMB could be internationalized.
That's true, but if it's not internationalized, it is in the process, let's say, being internationalized. If it's fully internationalized, of course, it's easier for the Chinese business community, like for Alibaba, for Huawei, to do investment in other countries. But still, yes, it's a technical issue. It is not that convenient, but still, you can overcome that difficulty to do investment in other countries. What you cannot overcome, probably, is the difficulty from the political setbacks, like in the United States. They using the national security reason to block the investment from Huawei. That is actually part of the protectionism.
Citing national security to excuse their protectionism.
Right.
Let's go back to the issue of the competitive edge of Chinese enterprises. First of all, your take.
The competitive edge of Chinese companies, first of all, they have plenty of money. And second, they have this
second money, third money, fourth money.
Well, we have innovation. And let me tell you one example. Huawei company, the telecommunications provider Huawei, last year alone, according to World Intellectual Property Organization, Huawei ranks the first of all patents application among all countries. And last year, Huawei sold more than 700 patents to the US company Apple. Well, at the same time, in the same year, Apple sold less than 100 patents to Huawei. So that demonstrates the strong ability of innovation of Chinese companies. It's just we're getting started.
Can I add something to that?
Yes.
In terms of innovation, a lot of people previously, like 2 or 3 years ago, if you talk to people, most of the people would say the Chinese companies are good copycat, but not good at innovation. But I can tell you, since last year or maybe 2014, you can see the changing perception, the changing understanding of the Chinese companies, especially these internet companies like Tencent, WeChat, the app, and also Alibaba, like PayPal, Chinese PayPal. You can see they say previously it's a one-way, one straight direction. That is the Chinese company learning from the counterpart in the US or European companies. But now they are also, it's a two-way street now. They are looking at WeChat, looking at Alibaba to learn some features, to borrow some features from their making. Like Twitter, Facebook is adding the feature of payment. You can use a wireless pay or internet payment, which is actually a practice, first initiated by the Chinese companies. So.
Yes, indeed, given the growing consensus that China is also a victim of IPR violations.
That's right.
The growing awareness about IPR protection may help strengthen the competitive edge and innovation of the Chinese enterprises when it comes to overseas investment. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue on the prospects of G20 in Hangzhou. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.